Hello and welcome to another lesson of Anglo-Saxon and Norman history. Today we are going to be studying the first two battles over the crown of England that took place in 1066, the first at Fulford and the second at Stamford Bridge, both of them in the north of England. We will begin by describing the preparations made by three claimants to the throne of England: Harold Godwinson, Harald Hardrada, and William the Duke of Normandy. We will then describe and explain the outcomes of the two battles, Gate Fulford and Stamford Bridge. So make sure you write down today's title, underline it, and go back to last lesson's work on the succession crisis and just make sure that that is finished. When you are ready, let's begin. So, last we left off, there were four claimants to the throne of England, and one of them, Earl Harold of Wessex, was crowned King Harold II of England. What we're going to look at first is what happened next in this story. So we will begin with this man here, Harald III, or, to give him his nickname, Harald Hardrada, which means hard ruler. So, the year before Harold's coronation, he exiled his own brother Tostig. He sided with the northern rebels. Tostig sailed to Norway, where he met with King Harald, and he convinced Hardrada to launch an invasion of England, based on his relatively weak claim that the crown of England should have passed from Harthacnut to his father Magnus. We looked at this last lesson. Now in March, Hardrada was beginning to assemble his fleet. This is 2 months after Harold's coronation of King of England, and Hardrada begins assembling his fleet on the south in southern Norway. We don't know how many men he had exactly, but we can estimate that it was about 15,000. He also had a lot of support from an army that Tostig had raised in Europe. We believe that he had about 300 longships by September. Now, his plan was to proclaim his son, Magnus, the King of Norway, before he left. We imagine because Hardrada believed that he might not make it back. So his son was proclaimed the King of Norway. Hardrada then launched his fleet from Solund in southern Norway. They sailed across the sea and they went to two small islands, Orkney and Shetland. Now today Orkney and Shetland are part of Scotland, but in the 11th century they were Viking strongholds. So his fleet stopped here. They picked up extra soldiers. They then sailed down the east coast of Scotland and they picked up some extra soldiers in Dunfermline, which is in central Scotland. It's not far from Glasgow, actually. Malcolm III, the King of Scotland, provided Hardrada with an extra 2,000 soldiers. So this invasion fleet is very strong, very dangerous, and by September it is near England. So that's Hardrada. Now, he wasn't the only person that was preparing, because in Normandy, in the north of France, William was preparing to launch his invasion as well. Just like Hardrada, William had ordered an armada of ships to be constructed, and his army, his ships were constructed at the River Dees in northern France, roughly same time as Hardrada, March 1066. By July, so a little bit before Hardrada, by the summer, by July, we think that he had about 5 to 10, anywhere between 5 and 10,000 soldiers, and he had about 700 large ships. He was supplied with soldiers not just from Normandy, but across France. He hired a lot of mercenaries, promising them land and titles and riches for any man that would help him capture England. William also had about 3,000 horses for his knights. He had lots of timber and construction equipment to build wooden castles. So this was a really strong invasion force. And by about August, so the month before Hardrada set sail, William was ready. So William was actually ready first. However, William could not set sail in August because the winds in the English Channel were really bad. If his fleet had set sail in August, they would have been destroyed by the bad, stormy weather. Therefore, William's invasion force was delayed, thus allowing Hardrada to launch first. Now, William believed that this was actually a curse, and he was in tears and he begged for the weather to change. However, this is actually going to be a blessing in disguise for William, and we will look at this a little bit later on in our next lesson, actually, when we look at the Battle of Hastings. There is some sources that suggest that William had the support of the Pope. Some sources say that he was given a papal banner, which is a large flag for him to carry into battle as evidence that God was on his side. Other sources suggest that he wasn't given this until after his conquest of England. So we're not too sure if that was the case in summer 1066. Okay, so two men, William and Harold, both of them building a fleet of ships ready to set sail for England. But in England itself, King Harold was also preparing. He was not stupid. He knew that the Normans, led by Duke William, would invade from the south. So the first thing that he did was he raised an army. He ordered his earls to raise their housecarls as well as their fyrd, and he managed to raise a very large army. In fact, it was the largest army that England had ever raised at that point. It consisted of roughly 8,000 men, and he stationed this army on the south of England. However, they could only wait for a certain amount of time. Because the winds had trapped William in Normandy, Harold waited until about September, and then he had to allow the fyrd to go home, because they had to get back to their crops or there would be no food for the incoming winter. Therefore, by September 1066, King Harold only had a couple of thousand housecarls, and that's about it. Now, we're going to pause there, and we're going to do our first task. For each of these men, you need to write down who they were, what country they represented, and how they prepared for battle following Edward's death. Okay? You can make it as colourful or as boring as you want. It should take about 1 page of your book. You can maybe print the pictures out and glue them into your book, and next to each, write this down, or you can just take 3 subheadings. If you get that finished, for a deeper understanding, you may wish to start to look at what advantages and disadvantages they had. So for example, King Harold, advantages: he knows the landscape very well, he is defending rather than attacking, which is always easier. However, he's had to disband his fyrd, so he's only got a limited amount of men. If you really want a deeper understanding, you can go through each of them and add in advantages and disadvantages. Okay? Should take you about 10 minutes. Best of luck. Okay, now that we've finished, just a quick recap. First one with the beard, that is Harald Hardrada. He represents Norway. He built a large invasion fleet. He picked up extra soldiers in Orkney and Shetland and Scotland. He managed to get his son proclaimed King of Norway, and by September 1066 he was on his way to England. Harold Godwinson, he raised an army of 8,000 men, stationed them on the south coast. Harold, of course, represents England, but by September he had to disband them because no invasion fleet had appeared. William, again, raises a very large army and a very large fleet of ships. He gathers men from across France and Normandy. He cannot set sail because of the bad weather. Okay? So 3 men, 3 preparations, all for the invasion of England. So, who arrived first? Well, unsurprisingly, it was the Vikings led by Hardrada and Tostig that landed first. It was actually very bad timing for King Harold. Only 10 days after he disbanded his army, that's when the Vikings invaded. Okay? They sailed from Norway, as I've said, down the east coast of England. Oh, sorry, they sailed from Scotland down the east coast of England. They raided Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast. They then sailed up the mouth of the Humber and they landed just outside York. So if you look at the map of England, right down past Newcastle and Middlesbrough, down past Hull, and that little bit that sticks out near Hull, that is known as the mouth of the Humber. They then sailed their narrow ships right up that, heading for York. The reason why they headed for York is because the York is the capital of the Danelaw, which you should remember from previous lessons, of course, was a typical Anglo-Danish area. So they're going to get a lot of support in the Danelaw. However, their army was actually stopped in their tracks by a little band, or a smaller band, of Anglo-Saxon soldiers led by the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia. Their names were Morcar and Edwin. Their job was to prevent the Vikings from capturing York in order to buy time for their king, Harold, to march north from London. Now, they met just outside of York, about 10 miles outside of York, and they were totally outnumbered. The Vikings had about 10,000 soldiers, whereas Earls Morcar and Edwin had less than that. They met at a place called Gate Fulford on the banks of the River Ouse, one of the main rivers that runs through York. On the one side of the a beck, which is like a little kind of shallow kind of stream, were Edwin and Morcar, and on the other side were Hardrada and his forces. When the water came down, making it passable, that is when the battle began. Now, if you look at this map, you will see the terrain, the geography plays a very big part in it. Not only is this beck going to be very swampy, very hard to walk on, you'll notice that also behind the English there is another marsh, swampy and boggy, and to the right hand side there is another marsh. So they're actually surrounded by marshland. Now this is going to play a very important part in the ending of the battle. So what happened was this. Hardrada and his best Viking soldiers remained at the back. He then allowed Tostig's men to charge the front line of the English. Whilst this was going on, the Vikings, led by Hardrada, went round past Edwin's forces and attacked them from behind. That meant that the English were totally trapped. They couldn't retreat because they have Hardrada's men there stopping them. They cannot go forward because they've got this swampy, boggy land. And if they retreat to the east, they will hit another boggy, marshy land. This is what actually happened. Many of them did flee, and because of the swamp, a lot of them drowned in the mud, and it made it really easy for the Vikings to cut them down. They were also hopelessly outnumbered against the Vikings. Unsurprisingly, Hardrada's forces wiped the floor with Edwin and Morcar. The two earls survive, but most of their army is cut down. The Vikings then progress and they capture the city of York. Now, we're going to pause here. We're going to do our second task. Now, you're more than welcome to watch the little video that's here in the YouTube clip that will show you what happened during the battle, or you could just use what I've told you. Totally up to you. And you're going to do the following. Using this and the video, you're going to draw a very detailed mind map about what happened, about the 3 reasons why the Vikings won. Okay, so we need a mind map with lots of images, lots of little doodles, lots of information, very colourful, explaining why the Vikings lost the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It should take you about 10 minutes to do. It is not a long task in any way. When you finish, you can then start to think of, were Hardrada and Tostig very lucky in this victory, or was it skill? So I'll give you some time to do that. Feel free to pause the video, and then we'll move on. Okay, so you should have 3 reasons why Hardrada and Tostig won. You may want to talk about numerical advantage. They had 3,000 more men than the English. This meant they could take more damage, they could keep fighting. It made it easier for them to break through the English shield wall. So numbers really plays an important part. Secondly, we have tactical mistakes. The English, led by Morcar and Edwin, positioned their army trapped between all these marshes. This meant that their soldiers had nowhere to go when they were pushed back. Lots of them got stuck in the mud, and it made them easier to kill. Lastly, Hardrada's clever strategy. He deliberately stayed at the back, allowed Tostig's men to charge, and then he went round the back and attacked the English from there. This allowed them to defeat the Saxons. So 3 main reasons why Hardrada and Tostig won. Were they lucky? I wouldn't say so. I think they were helped by solid numbers and solid strategy. Okay? So, after the defeat of, actually just before the Battle of Fulford, Harold had actually heard of this invasion. So as this battle was taking place, Harold has a very difficult task. He has to march north at lightning speed. He's got 185 miles to cover between London and York. And he has to also raise an army as he goes. He manages to do that, and it took him, amazingly, 5 days to get to York. This is really important because it means that the Vikings are taken totally by surprise. They were not expecting to see the King of England only 5 days, within 5 days. The fact that Harold did this was truly, truly amazing. Now, after the Battle of Fulford, Hardrada and Tostig were waiting just outside the city of York at a small area called Stamford Bridge. Okay, right on the banks of the River Derwent, there was one small, narrow bridge that crossed it, and they were celebrating their victory. They had left a smaller group of soldiers led by Hardrada's son-in-law. They're better soldiers, funnily enough, with all their armour back in their ships, which were about 20 miles away. So the Vikings that are on the banks of the River Derwent, not only are they unarmoured, but some of them are probably drunk and tired from the previous battle. They are not expecting to see the King of England, and that is exactly what happened. Harold Godwinson, his brother Geirth, and a large force of Anglo-Saxon housecarls and the general fyrd. The two armies would clash near York. You can see on this map at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada had about 7,000 men there, but he had another 3,000 at the south near Rickhall, which is closer to Gate Fulford. So straight away, Hardrada and Tostig have a massive disadvantage. Not only are their forces divided, not only have they not got any armour, but they are taken definitely by surprise. Okay? So that might be one reason to explain why the English won. Secondly, Harold has far more men than the Vikings. He's got 15,000 men, mostly from Wessex and East Anglia, because Morcar and Edwin's men had been massacred at the Battle of Fulford. He's got the element of surprise, but they are going to be slightly exhausted after that 5-day march. So 2 armies clashing at Stamford Bridge, separated by a small river. So as we can see, hopefully there isn't a delay, but if you've got the PowerPoint, you can skip ahead and see the diagram. We have the River Derwent and a small river on a small bridge. On the northern side of the river, you have the Vikings. They had to very quickly arrange themselves into a shield wall to protect themselves. And on the southern side of the river, you have King Harold's Anglo-Saxon army. To buy time to prevent the English from crossing that bridge, Hardrada asked for one very powerful Viking warrior go on that bridge and stop them crossing. And that warrior managed to kill so many English. Now, to get around that, Harold Godwinson ordered one of his men to float on a barrel underneath the bridge and spear the Viking from below. Then the two armies met shield wall to shield wall on the northern half of the river. Now, the Viking shield wall very quickly collapsed. Why? Because of what I just said to you earlier. They were exhausted, they were drunk, they didn't have any armour, they were not expecting an attack. Their better soldiers were 20 miles away at Rickhall. So very quickly, the battle came down to hand-to-hand combat, and at this point, Hardrada was killed with an arrow in his neck, and Tostig Godwinson was also killed. After that, the battle was over, and many of the Vikings fled. So, to recap, this is Stamford Bridge. After Fulford, Tostig and Hardrada were waiting here on the 25th of September, when all of a sudden an army attacked them, led by King Harold Godwinson. By time, Hardrada placed on that bridge a large Viking warrior to stop those men getting across, and hopefully you can see that on the screen. That Viking took out a lot of English men. To get round this problem, they speared him from below by floating on a barrel. Once that Viking was dead, the English charged across the bridge, and it came down to shield wall, batting off each other, ramming off each other. But this was eventually broken. The two forces fought for hours. Many Vikings were fighting without any armour, and they also were very surprised because they didn't expect the English to fight so ferociously. They were told that their king, Harold Godwinson, was very unpopular, yet all of a sudden all these people are fighting passionately for their king. Remember, the better Vikings were 20 miles away. It's going to take them a long time to arrive to reinforce Hardrada. But by that point it was too late. Hardrada was shot in the neck by an arrow, and Tostig was also killed. This was a humiliating defeat for the Vikings. Out of the 300 ships that came to England, only 24 of them were told to go home. Harold Godwinson, in a final act of mercy, allowed the Vikings to carry Hardrada's body back to Norway if they promised never to return. So, last task for today. You are going to complete a little short comic strip on the battles of Stamford Bridge. If there is no picture, you have to draw a little picture. If there is a picture, you have to write about what is happening. When you have done that, glue it into your book, and then you're going to explain the consequences of the battle. So what was the impact of this battle for King Harold? That should take you the last 10 minutes of the lesson. So pause the video now, have a go on it, and then I will go through the answers. Best of luck. Okay, so your comic strip. First of all, it's early morning. Harold attacks the Vikings. The Vikings are caught by surprise. The third picture is the large Viking on the bridge, preventing the English from crossing to buy time for Hardrada. After an hour, they try and stop him, so you should be drawing them floating on a barrel under the bridge. Next one, the Viking is speared from below, then the English cross the bridge. The battle comes down to shield wall, but by midday, Harold's army is in complete control and Hardrada is killed. Seventh box is the death of Tostig, who was also killed in the battle. Eighth box is Harold Godwinson being the winner, and the last box is empty. If I was you, I would write down that out of the 300 ships, only 24 of them went back to Norway. What were the consequences of this battle? Well, first of all, the invasions had wiped out the armies of Northumbria and Mercia, so that weakened King Harold's forces. By marching north to stop the Vikings, Harold had left the south of his kingdom totally undefended. The march up to London, up to York and back down to London would have exhausted King Harold's men. But on a positive consequence, Norway was no longer a threat after the defeat of Hardrada. In fact, the Battle of Stamford Bridge marks the end of the Viking Age in England. Okay? And that ends our lesson for today. Next lesson, we will be looking at the invasion of William and what's going to happen when Harold Godwinson faces with him. So, thanks for listening and tune in next time.